Della Selby had not seen sunlight in 11 days when the boots stopped outside her door. She knew every sound the cellar made, the drip of condensation against stone, the scratch of mice behind the grain barrels, the distant clang of the kitchen above her head. But these boots were wrong, too heavy, too deliberate. And the voice that followed them belonged to a man she had never heard speak, low and certain and laced with something that made the copper ring on her finger hum against her skin like a struck bell. "This door," he said. "Open it." She pressed her back against the far wall and held her breath. 3 years. 3 years she had lived beneath the floors of Stroud's riverside hold, dyeing wool in a stone room that smelled of mordant and mildew, sleeping on a pallet that had long since lost any resemblance to comfort. 3 years since Bowen Stroud had purchased her bond contract from a trader who dealt in debts the way other men dealt in grain, quietly, profitably, and without conscience. She had been 15. She was 18 now, though she had stopped counting birthdays the second winter, when counting felt like cruelty. The cellar was large enough to work in and small enough to feel like a throat closing. A single oil lamp hung from an iron hook on the wall, its flame the only warmth she was allowed. Her hands were stained indigo and rust from the dyes she mixed, her fingernails cracked, her knees calloused from kneeling over the stone basin where she rinsed fabric until her arms shook. She wore the same thing she always wore, an oat-colored linen shift so thin she could feel every draft, a rope belt cinched at her waist, no shoes. Shoes were a privilege, and Della had long since stopped qualifying for privileges. But she was not broken. Bowen Stroud had tried. He had tried with silence and isolation, with withheld meals and the slow erosion of every small dignity a person could possess. He had tried by telling her that no one was looking for her, that no one remembered her name, that the world above had forgotten she existed, and in the quiet hours when the lamp burned low and the dark pressed in like water, she had sometimes believed him. But not always, not entirely. There was a core of something in Della that refused to dissolve, a stubbornness that lived in her bones the way dye lived in wool, permanent and impossible to rinse out. She had survived by being useful, by producing colors so rich and consistent that Stroud's textiles fetched prices far above their worth, by making herself indispensable enough that he could not afford to let her starve. Survival was not freedom, she knew that, but survival was the step that came before everything else, and she had become very, very good at taking that step. Now the boots had stopped, and the voice was speaking, and somewhere above the stone ceiling, something was happening that she did not understand. She had heard the preparations for days. Footsteps multiplied. Voices she didn't recognize echoed through the hold. The kitchen above her had been churning out food in quantities that made the floor vibrate. Someone important was coming. That much she gathered from the scraps of conversation that filtered down through the cracks. She had not expected anyone to come down. Faye was the only person who visited the cellar. Faye, the kitchen attendant who brought her meals twice a day, who sometimes lingered at the door with an expression that looked like guilt wearing the mask of indifference. Faye, who had once left an extra blanket folded outside the cellar door in the dead of winter and never mentioned it. But the voice outside was not Faye's, and the second voice, the one that answered, was Stroud's. She knew his voice the way a rabbit knows the sound of a hawk's wings, by instinct and by fear. "That room is storage, Your Majesty. Grain and surplus wool. Nothing worth your attention." "Your Majesty." The words hit her like cold water. "I didn't ask what was in it. I said open it." A silence. The kind of silence that vibrates at a frequency only terror produces. "With respect, Alpha King, the hold has been fully presented for your inspection. Every chamber, every corridor, every—" "Not every." Another silence. Longer this time. Della pressed her hands flat against the stone wall behind her. The copper ring on her finger, her mother's ring, The only thing she had left of a life before this cellar was vibrating. Not figuratively. Physically trembling against her skin, a faint hum that traveled up her wrist and into her chest, where it bloomed into something warm and terrifying. She heard Stroud's breathing. Ragged. Panicked. She had never heard him panicked before. Stroud was the kind of man whose composure was a weapon, calm in the way that a snake is calm before it strikes. The key, Stroud. Alpha King, I must insist. You must insist on nothing. You are a territorial pack alpha hosting a crown inspection. I have asked to see behind a locked door. If you refuse, I will open it myself, and the door will not survive the process. A pause. Neither will your standing. Metal scraped against metal. The lock. Della's heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She wanted to hide, but there was nowhere to hide in a room she had been unable to leave for 3 years. She wanted to stand, but her legs had gone liquid. She crouched beside the dye basin, her stained hands gripping its edge, and watched the door. It opened. Light flooded in. Real light, torchlight from the corridor that was brighter than anything her oil lamp could produce. And she squinted against it, raising one hand to shield her eyes. 2 silhouettes filled the doorway. One she recognized. Stroud's narrow shoulders, the way he held himself like a man calculating the cost of every moment. The other was something else entirely. He was tall. That was the first thing she registered through the glare, tall in a way that had nothing to do with mere height and everything to do with how the space around him rearranged itself, compressing, deferring. Broad through the shoulders, dressed in gray and dark blue and black, with a copper circlet across his brow that caught the torchlight like a thin band of captured flame. His hair was black, cut short and swept back from a face that was all clean angles and controlled stillness. Sharp jaw, straight nose, a mouth pressed into a line that might have been fury or might have been something far more complicated. His eyes were dark green. She had never seen eyes that color before, deep and steady, like the river she sometimes heard through the walls but had not seen in 3 years. And they were looking at her. Not at the room, not at the dye basins or the wool or the pallet on the floor or the lamp guttering on its hook. At her. A sound escaped him. Low, involuntary, like something cracking open inside his chest. His hand caught the edge of the door frame, and his knuckles went white. The warmth in Della's chest surged. Golden light flickered at the edge of her vision, just for an instant, there and gone, like sunlight breaking through clouds and vanishing again. What is this? His voice had changed. The authority was still there, but underneath it, something raw and dangerous. A tone she recognized instinctively as the sound a man makes when he is trying very hard not to destroy something. She's a bonded laborer, Stroud said quickly. A dyer. She works the wool. The arrangement is entirely... She is barefoot. The words were quiet. She is alone. In a cellar. Behind a locked door. The arrangement is standard for... She has no shoes. He said it again. Differently this time, and Della watched something happen behind those dark green eyes that she did not have a name for. Something that made the air in the corridor feel thinner, heavier, charged with a pressure that hummed at the same frequency as her copper ring. He stepped into the cellar. The ceiling was low enough that he had to angle his head, and the room, which had always felt small, suddenly felt impossible. He filled it. Not just with his body, but with something else. A presence that was warm and vast and terrifying, the way a fire is terrifying when you have lived in the cold so long you've forgotten what warmth costs. He crouched in front of her, slowly, carefully, the way a person moves when they are aware that their size could frighten. His eyes found hers, and the golden flicker came again, stronger now. A pulse of light at the periphery of her vision that made her gasp. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice was different this close, rough at the edges but underneath the roughness, something almost gentle, something that made her throat ache. She should have been afraid. Every lesson survival had taught her said this was dangerous, that powerful men who crouched in front of captive women were never safe, that kindness from above was always a transaction. But her copper ring was humming against her skin, and the warmth in her chest had spread to her fingertips. And her wolf that had been so quiet for so long, was pressing against the inside of her ribs with a force that made her sway. "Della," she said. Her voice was rough from disuse. She spoke to no one but Faye, and even those conversations were measured in single sentences. "My name is Della." Something moved across his face. Not pity. She would have flinched from pity. This was recognition, the look of a man who has found something he was searching for and cannot quite believe it exists. "Della." He said her name like he was learning the weight of it. "I'm Asher. I'm taking you out of this room, and I need you to know that you are not going into another one like it." She stared at him. Her hands were shaking. The dye stains on her fingers looked obscene against the clean wool of his coat sleeve where he braced himself against the floor. "You don't know me," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I know what this is." He touched his own chest, pressing his palm flat over his sternum. "And I know what that door means. And I know that whoever put you behind it is going to answer for it in ways he has not yet imagined." He carried her up the stairs. She did not ask him to. She stood on her own, walked 3 steps toward the door on legs that trembled, and then her knees buckled, and he caught her without a word, lifting her as though she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest with one arm beneath her knees and the other around her back. Della did not fight it. She was too stunned to fight, too overwhelmed by the sudden assault of sensation, the brightness of the corridor, the smell of roasted meat drifting from the kitchens, the warmth of his body against hers, which was so profoundly, impossibly warm that she felt tears burn behind her eyes. She kept them closed. She was not ready to see the world yet. They emerged into the great hall, and the hall went silent. She could hear it, the conversations dying like flames in a sudden wind, the scrape of chairs, the intake of breath from a dozen throats. She pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed in the smell of him, cedar and clean wool and something underneath that was wild and green, like forests she had not walked in for 3 years. "Alpha King!" Stroud's voice, following them, pitched higher now, cracking at the edges. "If you would allow me to explain the girl's contract—" "Sit down, Stroud." Asher's voice vibrated through his chest and into hers. "Sit down, be silent, and pray that my self-control outlasts this conversation." Silence. He took her to a room. Not the cellar, not a servant's chamber, but a room with a real bed and a window. An actual window with glass and light streaming through it, and curtains that moved in a breeze she could feel on her face. He set her down on the bed, and she sat there gripping the edge of the mattress, staring at the window with an expression she could not control. Sunlight. It was afternoon sunlight, golden and warm, falling across the stone floor in a long rectangle that looked like a doorway to somewhere else. "I'll send for food," Asher said. He was standing near the door, as far from her as the room allowed, giving her space. "And clothes. And someone to attend you if you want. Or no one. Whatever you need." Della couldn't look away from the window. "Why?" she managed. "Because you're my mate." The word landed in the center of her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples spread outward, and the golden light flared at the edge of her vision, brighter now, sustained, and she felt the copper ring on her finger vibrate so hard it rattled against the bone. She turned to look at him. He stood with his hands at his sides, his jaw tight, his dark green eyes fixed on her with an intensity that should have been terrifying and wasn't. She could see the effort it cost him to stay by the door, could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers curled and uncurled, the way his breathing had gone carefully, deliberately steady. "The bond isn't the reason I took you out of that cellar," he said. "I would have taken anyone out of that cellar. No one should live like that. But the bond is why I found it." I walked into Stroud's hold for a routine inspection, and something in me turned and walked toward the east wing instead of following his tour. Something in me heard you through stone and wood and 3 locked doors, and it would not let me walk away. "I don't know what a bond is," Della whispered. "I don't know what you're talking about. I've been in a cellar for 3 years. I don't know anything about mates or kings or whatever you're saying." "I know." His voice cracked, just barely. A fracture in the composure that she suspected cost him dearly. "And I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you lost 3 years to that room. I'm sorry that I didn't come sooner. I didn't know you were here. No one did." Faye knew. "Who is Faye?" "The kitchen attendant. She brought me food. She was—" Della stopped. Kind was too simple a word for what Faye had been. Faye had been the thin line between survival and surrender. "She was the only person who treated me like I was real." "I'll find her," Asher said. "She's safe. No one who helped you will be punished." He left. The door stayed open. She stared at the open door for a long time, waiting for someone to close it. No one did. The food arrived before the close: a tray of roasted root vegetables, warm bread with butter, a bowl of clear broth, and a wedge of sharp yellow cheese. Simple food, nothing extravagant. And she wondered if he had chosen it deliberately, if he had understood without being told that richness would overwhelm a stomach that had lived on thin porridge and stale bread for 3 years. She ate slowly, not because she wanted to, but because her body had forgotten how to eat without caution. Each bite was an act of recalibration, her throat remembering what it felt like to swallow something that tasted like it had been made with care. Faye found her an hour later. The attendant appeared in the doorway, her face blotched and red, her hands knotted in her apron. "I didn't tell them," Faye said immediately. "I swear I didn't. The Alpha King, he just walked past the kitchens and kept going. Nobody guided him. Nobody said a word." "I know," Della said. "Faye, I know." Faye crossed the room and knelt beside the bed and took Della's stained hands in hers. "You're out," she whispered. "You're actually out. I'm out." They sat together in silence, and Faye's shoulders shook, and Della held her hands, and the sunlight moved across the floor in its slow, golden arc, and neither of them said the things they were both thinking. That out was a direction, not a destination, and that freedom, when it arrives without warning, feels less like release and more like falling. Della did not sleep that night. The bed was too soft. The room was too quiet, missing the cellar's constant drip, the scuttle of mice, the groan of the hold settling into its foundations. She lay in the dark and listened to the silence and tried to make her body understand that it was safe. Her body did not believe her. It remained coiled, alert, waiting for the lock to turn, for the darkness to become permanent again. She catalogued the room by sound, the way she had catalogued the cellar: the creak of the bed frame when she shifted, the whisper of curtains in the draft from the window, the distant murmur of the river through glass. The window was the hardest part. She could see the sky through it, dark and vast and pricked with stars, and the sheer openness of it made her chest tight. She had dreamed of windows in the cellar, had pressed her hands against stone and imagined glass, imagined light, imagined the way a curtain moved in wind. Now she had all of it, and the reality was so much larger than the imagining that her nervous system couldn't hold it all. She pulled the blankets over her head and breathed in the warm dark beneath them, a smaller space, a space she could manage, and hated herself for needing smallness even now. Near midnight, she heard footsteps in the corridor. She recognized them immediately, the same heavy, deliberate tread that had stopped outside her cellar door hours ago. They paused outside her room. She watched the thin line of light beneath the door, saw the shadow of his boots, and held her breath. He didn't knock. He didn't enter. He simply stood there for several minutes, breathing on the other side of the wood, and then he walked away. In the morning, she found a pair of soft leather shoes outside her door. Simple, well-made, the right size. No note. She held them in her hands and stared at them until her vision blurred. She put them on. They fit. The leather was warm against her bare feet, and the sensation of being shod, of having something between her skin and the cold stone, was so viscerally overwhelming that she had to sit back down on the bed and press her hands over her face until the feeling passed. Then she stood and walked to the window and looked outside for the first time. The river. Wide and slow and green, curving through a valley of old trees and meadow grass. She could hear it through the glass, a low, constant song, and it sounded exactly the way she had imagined it during 3 years of listening through walls. Asher came to see her that afternoon. He knocked first. She said nothing, but she didn't tell him to go, so he opened the door and stood in the doorway with his hands visible at his sides. A gesture she was beginning to understand. He showed her his hands the way you show a cornered animal that you carry no weapon. "You don't have to talk to me," he said. "I came to tell you that I've sent for a healer from the capital. She'll arrive in 2 days, and I've started proceedings against Stroud." Proceedings? The word tasted strange in her mouth. Formal. Distant. As though what had happened to her could be contained in a word that belonged in a courtroom. "He's confined to his quarters. His hold is under Crown authority until the inquiry concludes." Asher's jaw tightened. "He kept you in a cellar for 3 years. He will answer for every single day." Della pulled her knees up on the bed and wrapped her arms around them. "What happens to me?" "Whatever you want." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have." He took one step into the room, then stopped. "I am not going to tell you what to do. I am not going to decide where you go or how you live. You've had 3 years of someone else making those decisions, and I will not add a single day to that count. You said I'm your mate. You are. And that doesn't mean I belong to you. It means I belong to you." He said it simply, without ceremony, without the dramatic weight she might have expected. Like a fact. Like weather. "The bond goes both ways, Della. It's not a chain. It's a door that opens from both sides." She studied him. He stood in a shaft of afternoon light, and she could see him clearly now in a way the cellar's dimness had not allowed. The fine lines at the corners of his eyes. The scar along his left knuckle. The way he held his shoulders. Not with aggression, but with the measured stillness of a man who had learned to make himself smaller than he was so as not to frighten the people he was trying to protect. "I don't trust you," she said. "I know. I don't trust anyone. I know that too. So, what do you want from me?" "Time." He met her eyes, and the golden light flickered between them, warm and brief, like a candle flame cupped in careful hands. "Just time. Stay here. Heal. Eat food that someone prepared with care rather than contempt. Walk outside. Feel the sun. Let the healer see to whatever needs seeing. And if, after all of that, you want to leave, I will provide you with funds and passage to wherever you choose to go. No conditions. No bond invoked. No debt. You would let me leave? I would hate it." The roughness in his voice deepened. "But I would let you go, because the alternative is another locked door, and I will not be another man who keeps you behind one." He left. The door stayed open. Again. The healer arrived on the second day. A woman named Marguerite with steady hands and kind, assessing eyes that catalogued Della's condition without judgment. She examined the calluses on Della's knees, the thinness of her frame, the cracked nails and stained skin, and she said nothing except what needed saying, that nutrition and rest and sunlight would do more than any tonic. "Your wolf," Marguerite said carefully, pressing her fingertips to Della's wrist. "She's there. I can feel her, but she's retreated deep, the way wolves do when the body is in extended distress. She's been keeping you alive, redirecting her energy into survival rather than shifting." "I haven't shifted since before the cellar," Della said. "I thought she was gone. Not gone, waiting." Marguerite released her wrist. Wolves don't leave their hosts. They adapt. When the body no longer needs every resource for survival, she'll surface. It may be sudden when it happens. Della looked at her stained hands. "Will it hurt?" Marguerite was quiet for a moment. "The shift itself? No. What comes after? Feeling everything you haven't allowed yourself to feel for 3 years that May." On the third day, Della went outside. She stood in the courtyard of Stroud's Hold, shoes on her feet, face tilted toward the sky, and breathed air that was not filtered through stone. The sun hit her skin, and she closed her eyes, and she stood there so long that Faye came looking for her, worried. "I'm fine," Della said, though she was crying. "I'm fine. The sky is just bigger than I remembered." She walked the perimeter of the courtyard, touching things. The rough bark of an oak that grew beside the stables. The warm stone of a wall that had absorbed hours of sunlight. A wooden fence post worn smooth by the hands and shoulders of people who had leaned against it for generations. Each texture was a revelation, a reminder that the world was not made entirely of cold stone and damp. She found a patch of wildflowers growing in the gap between 2 flagstones. Small, stubborn things, purple and yellow, pushing up through cracks that should not have allowed anything to grow. She crouched beside them and touched their petals and thought about the dye she could make from them, the colors she could coax from their pigments, and realized that her mind was already working, already creating, already refusing to be still. She had never stopped being a dyer, even in the cellar, even in the dark. The work had been a form of defiance she hadn't recognized until now. On the 4th day, Asher found her by the river. She had walked there alone, following the sound she had listened to for 3 years through walls and floors and ceilings. The water was exactly what she had imagined, wide and green and slow, murmuring over smooth stones in a voice that sounded like patience. He sat down beside her on the bank, leaving a careful distance between them, and they said nothing for a long time. The golden flicker came and went between them, a pulse of light she was learning to recognize, warm and persistent, and strangely comforting, like a heartbeat she could see. "He bought my contract when I was 15, she said finally, not looking at him. "My mother died, and the debt passed to me. She'd borrowed from a bonding house to pay for my father's treatment when he was sick. He died anyway. The interest accumulated. Stroud's man found me in a border village, working as a laundress. He said I could work off the debt in a season." She pulled a blade of grass from the earth and twisted it between her stained fingers. "The first year, I worked in the dye shed above ground. I was good at it, better than his other dyers. I could match colors that no one else could mix shades from feel and instinct rather than recipe. His wool brought premium prices at market because of my work. He realized I was valuable." Her voice flattened. "Valuable things get locked up." Asher was very still beside her. She could feel the tension radiating from him, could feel the bond between them vibrating with something that tasted like fury held on a very short leash. "The second year, he moved me to the cellar, said it was for security, that the dyes were sensitive to light, that the work required specific conditions. It sounded almost reasonable, and I was too tired to argue. By the time I realized the door was locked from the outside, it was already normal." "There is nothing normal about a cage," Asher said. His voice was quiet, controlled, but beneath the control she could hear something straining, something that wanted to break. No, she agreed. But you can learn to mistake the walls for safety if you spend enough time inside them. That's the trick of it. That's what he understood. You don't break people by hurting them. You break them by making captivity feel like the only option. She turned to look at him. His hands were fists on his knees. His jaw was set so hard she could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin. And his eyes, those dark green eyes that had looked at her in the cellar like she was something found rather than something caught, were bright with a rage so tightly contained it was nearly invisible. "I am not broken," she said. "No." His voice fractured. "You are not. I need you to understand that. Whatever this bond is, whatever you feel when you look at me, I am not a rescue. I am not a project. I survived 3 years in that cellar by being smarter and tougher and more stubborn than the man who put me there, and I did it alone. I know. So if you're here because you feel sorry for me, I'm here because I can't breathe properly when I'm more than 50 feet from you." He said it raw, unvarnished, without the careful diplomatic phrasing she had come to expect from him. "I'm here because I have spent 3 days pretending to conduct an inquiry, while every instinct I possess is howling at me to be wherever you are. I'm here because the bond between us is the loudest thing in my body, and I have been a king for 12 years, and I have never, not once, felt anything as certain as the knowledge that you are mine and I am yours." The golden light flared, not at the edges this time, but between them, a warm pulse that she could almost see, almost touch, hanging in the air above the river like heat, rising from sun-warmed stone. "I don't know how to do this," Della whispered. "Neither do I." She looked at his hands, still curled into fists on his knees. She reached out and touched his wrist, gently, barely a press of her fingertips against the skin where his pulse hammered. His entire body went rigid. His breath stopped. "You're shaking," she said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because the last time someone touched me with that much care, I was a child, and because your hands are stained with dye, and they are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, and I am terrified of wanting something this much." She didn't pull away. The golden light pulsed between them, steady now, warm, a rhythm that matched the river and the sun and the slow, cautious opening of something inside her chest that she had sealed shut 3 years ago. "Time," she said. "You asked for time." "Yes." "Then stop shaking and sit with me. The river sounds exactly the way I imagined." He settled beside her, and they listened. The water moved over the stones in a language she had spent 3 years translating through walls and hearing it unfiltered, unmediated by stone and wood and darkness, was so beautiful it ached. "My father was a good king," Asher said after a while. His voice was quieter now, stripped of its authority, just a man talking by a river. "He was fair and strategic and beloved. He was also the loneliest person I've ever known." Della turned her head slightly, not looking at him directly, giving him the same privacy of sideways attention that Faye had given her when the cellar walls pressed too close. "He took the throne at 19, married at 20 for alliance. My mother was a good woman, and they respected each other. But the bond between them was political, not fated. He told me once that there were some mornings when he woke and couldn't remember why any of it mattered. The crown, the territories, the endless procession of disputes and treaties and people who wanted things from him." Asher picked up a stone from the bank and turned it in his fingers. He said the only thing that kept him steady was knowing that somewhere in the world there was a person whose existence would make the rest of it bearable. He just never found them. Did he look? Every day, in every face, at every gathering. He told me he could feel the absence of it, like a room where something vital has been removed, and you can see the outline on the wall where it used to hang. Asher tossed the stone into the river. It disappeared without a splash, swallowed by the current. "He died when I was 20. I've been carrying his kingdom and his loneliness ever since. The golden light pulsed softly between them. Della felt it settle in her chest like warm water filling a vessel she hadn't known was empty. "You're telling me this because you want me to understand that you're lonely," she said. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that I know what it means to be surrounded by stone and feel invisible. My walls were larger than yours. They had tapestries and banquet halls and a crown that people bowed to, but they were walls." She looked at him then. Really looked, the way she had looked at the river when she first saw it, with the raw attention of someone seeing something for the first time that they had only ever imagined. "We're a pair," she said. "A king in a palace and a dyer in a cellar, both living inside walls. And both of us," he said, "just heard the river." The inquiry unfolded over the next week. Asher's officials documented everything: the cellar, the contract, the locked door, the absence of Della's name from any census or registry in Stroud's territory. They interviewed servants. They examined financial records. They found what Della had always suspected but could never prove. Her debt had been paid off 18 months ago. The interest Stroud claimed was fabricated. He had kept her because she was profitable, not because she owed him anything. Stroud maintained his composure through most of it. He was a man who had survived decades in territorial politics by knowing when to concede and when to deflect. And he deployed both strategies with practiced ease. Yes, the girls' accommodations were regrettable. Yes, administrative errors had been made. Yes, he took full responsibility and would of course provide appropriate compensation. It was on the 6th day, when Asher informed him that the inquiry would be elevated to a full tribunal before the regional council, that Stroud's composure cracked. Della was in the corridor when it happened. She had not intended to be there. She had been walking, still exploring the hold above ground, still learning the geography of freedom. But Stroud's study door was open, and his voice carried. "This is about the girl, isn't it?" Stroud's voice, stripped of its careful smoothness. "Not the contract, not the debt. This is about your bond. You found something pretty in my cellar, and now you're tearing my house apart to justify keeping it." Della stopped walking. "If you think," Asher's voice dangerously quiet, "that my response to finding a person imprisoned in your cellar would have been different if she were not my mate, then you understand nothing about the crown you serve. She's an Omega, an unclaimed, unregistered Omega. Do you have any idea what she's worth on the bonding market? I was protecting her. You were profiting from her. I gave her shelter, work, purpose. Without me, she would have ended up in a bonding house, sold to the highest bidder, mated against her will. I kept her safe. You kept her in a cellar. I kept her hidden." The silence that followed was absolute. Della leaned against the corridor wall, her hands flat on the stone, and felt something settle inside her with the weight of certainty. She had spent 3 years questioning her own reality, wondering if Stroud's version of events, in which he was protector rather than captor, might contain some kernel of truth. Hearing him say it aloud, hearing the justification spoken in his own voice, incinerated the last shred of doubt. She stepped into the doorway. Both men turned. Stroud's face went pale. Asher's expression shifted into something careful, watchful, his eyes finding hers with a question in them that she answered by walking forward. She could feel the golden light surging at the edges of her vision, brighter than it had ever been, and with it came a sensation she barely recognized, her wolf pressing forward, rising from the deep place where she had been sleeping for 3 years. Not fully, not yet, but closer to the surface than Della had felt since before the cellar. The wolf's awareness layered over her own, sharpening her senses, steadying her pulse, lending her a calm that was not the absence of fear but the mastery of it. "You're right about one thing," Della said, and her voice was steady. She looked at Stroud, at the man who had been the architect of her smallest world for 3 years, and she felt the familiar architecture of fear, and then she felt it crack. I am an omega. I didn't know it when you bought my contract. I didn't know what the dye sensitivity was, or why I could match colors no one else could, or why the bond traders kept circling the village where I lived. But you knew. Stroud's eyes darted to Asher. Back to Della. You knew what I was, and you hid me. Not to protect me. To own a resource no one else knew existed. An Omega's labor, an Omega's instincts, an Omega's skill, all of it locked in your cellar, producing wealth that you told the markets came from your own dyers. You have no proof of... I have 3 years of proof. She stepped closer. The golden light was blazing at the edges of her vision now, bright and fierce, and she realized with a jolt that it wasn't fear she felt. It was clarity, the kind of seeing that comes when the walls finally come down and the world is larger than you remembered. I have every bolt of wool I dyed, every color I mixed, every batch record that Faye smuggled into the margins of the kitchen accounts, because she always knew that someday someone would come looking for the truth. Stroud's mouth opened, closed. Faye kept records? Asher's voice, quiet, with something in it that might have been admiration. Faye kept everything. Della turned to face the Alpha King. She couldn't get me out. She didn't have the power, but she made sure there would be evidence for whoever did. Something moved across Asher's face. That recognition again, the same expression he had worn in the cellar when he first looked at her. Not pity, not rescue, something deeper, something that looked like the moment a person realizes the ground they are standing on is more solid than they knew. She documented everything? He asked. Everything. Dates, quantities, payment records cross-referenced with market prices. 3 years of proof that his wool revenue depended entirely on a girl he told the census was dead. Stroud lunged, not at Della, toward the desk, toward a drawer that she suspected contained documents he wanted to destroy. But Asher was between them before the movement was complete, one hand catching Stroud's wrist with a grip that made the older man's face contort. I told you, Asher said softly, that my self-control would outlast this conversation. He released Stroud's wrist and stepped back. I was wrong. It nearly didn't. He turned to the guards in the corridor. Confine him. She kissed him that night. Not because the bond demanded it, though it hummed between them with an urgency that made her teeth ache. Not because he had defended her, though the image of him stepping between her and Stroud had lodged itself somewhere permanent in her chest. She kissed him because he had stood in the doorway of her room that evening to tell her that Faye's records had been retrieved and secured, and when she had said, "Thank you," he had looked at her with those dark green eyes and said, "Don't thank me. Thank Faye. She was braver than anyone in this hold, including me." And the way he said it, giving the credit to the kitchen attendant who had fed a captive girl for 3 years and kept meticulous records in the margins of account books, that was the moment Della's last wall came down. She crossed the room. She stood in front of him in the doorway. She saw his eyes widen, saw his hands flex at his sides, saw the effort it cost him not to reach for her. Della, he said, her name a warning and a prayer in the same breath. She put her hands on his chest. She could feel his heart hammering beneath the wool of his coat, fast and hard, a rhythm that matched the golden pulse between them. I still don't trust you, she said. I know. I may never fully trust anyone. I know that too. But I am choosing to do this. She lifted her chin. Not because of the bond, not because you rescued me, because you gave Faye credit for the bravery, because you left my door open, because you brought me shoes before you brought me politics, and because you sat by a river with me for an hour without saying a single unnecessary word. She kissed him. His hands came up slowly, trembling, cupping her face with a gentleness that made her chest ache. He kissed her back the way he did everything, with devastating patience, with controlled intensity, with a restraint that made the heat beneath it all the more staggering. His thumbs traced her cheekbones. His breath shuddered against her mouth. The golden light between them blazed, not a flicker now, but a sustained glow, and she felt the bond snap tight with a sound she heard inside her body, a note so clear and true that it resonated in her bones. She could feel him through it, his fury still simmering, his fear, not of her, but for her, his certainty, which was vast and total and had been there since the moment he walked into the cellar. And underneath all of it, a loneliness so deep and old that it matched her own, a recognition that they had both been living behind walls, his made of duty and hers made of stone. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers, and his eyes were closed, and his breathing was ragged, and the golden light pulsed between them like a second heartbeat. "I need you to know something," he murmured. "What?" "The inquiry, the tribunal, Stroud's punishment. I would have done all of it regardless. Every piece of it. I need you to know that. I do know that. I would have burned this hold to the foundations for anyone I found in that cellar. I know. But for you." His voice broke. "For you, I would have burned the foundations too." The next morning, Della heard the whispers. She was walking through the corridor toward the kitchens when two of Stroud's retainers passed her, their voices dropping to a register that they clearly believed was private. It wasn't. 3 years of silence had made Della's hearing sharper than most wolves. "The Alpha King is compromising the entire inspection over a cellar girl. The Northern Ridge delegation is already questioning his judgment. If Stroud's territory destabilizes, the river trade collapses, and 3 provinces starve. It's the bond. He can't think clearly. An unclaimed Omega surfaces, and suddenly the king is making decisions with his instincts instead of his crown. Someone needs to tell her. If she had any decency, she'd remove herself from the equation before the king destroys his own standing over a dyer's apprentice." They turned the corner and were gone, leaving Della standing in the corridor with her hand pressed against the wall, breathing through the tightness in her chest. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself that whispers were just air shaped into cruelty, and she had survived worse than words. But the words burrowed. They found the cracks that 3 years of captivity had left in her, the places where doubt lived like mold in damp stone. Was she a liability? Was his judgment compromised? She thought of Asher standing between her and Stroud, thought of the fury in his voice, the way his entire bearing had changed in her presence, and she wondered for the first time if the bond was a gift or a distortion, if removing herself would let him rule clearly. She packed what little she had, the copper ring, the shoes he'd left at her door, the dark blue dress Faye had altered. It all fit in a bundle she could carry with one hand. She was standing at the east gate, the one that led to the river road and the border beyond it, when Faye found her. "Don't," Faye said. Della's jaw tightened. "You don't know what I'm doing. You're running. You're running because someone said something cruel, and your first instinct is still to disappear, because disappearing is what kept you safe." Faye's voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with something that might have been anger. "You survived 3 years in a cellar by making yourself small. You do not owe anyone your smallness anymore. If I stay, I compromise him, his standing, his authority. The Northern Ridge is already questioning. The Northern Ridge questions everything. That's what they do. They questioned his tax reforms, his border treaties, his decision to wear copper instead of gold. If you leave because powerful men are inconvenienced by a king who loves a dyer, then Stroud wins. He buried you for 3 years, and you are handing him the shovel." Della stood at the gate. The road stretched out before her, open and empty, and she realized with a sick lurch that it looked exactly like freedom and nothing like it. The gate was open, and she was choosing to walk through it, not because she wanted to go, but because she was afraid to stay. She thought of Asher's voice. The bond is a door that opens from both sides. She thought of her own hands, stained and strong, holding the edge of a dye basin while the world above forgot she existed. She thought of the golden light that flared between them, steady and warm, pulsing with a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat, and she realized that leaving would not remove the bond. It would just mean carrying it alone, and she had carried enough alone. She put down the bundle. "If anyone asks," Della said, "I went for a walk." "A very short walk," Faye said, and picked up the bundle and carried it back inside. Della did not tell Asher about the gate, but that night, when he came to her door to report on the inquiry's progress, she reached for his hand without explanation and held it, and when he looked at her with a question in his dark green eyes, she said, "I stayed." "I know," he said. "I always knew you would." "You didn't. You couldn't have." "No." His fingers tightened around hers. "But I hoped. And hope from you is worth more than certainty from anyone else." The tribunal took place 12 days after Asher first opened the cellar door. It was held in the great hall of Stroud's own hold before the regional council and representatives from 4 neighboring territories. Della stood before them in clothing she had chosen herself, a simple dress of dark blue wool that Faye had altered to fit her, with the copper ring on her finger and shoes on her feet, and her hair washed clean and falling loose past her shoulders for the first time in years. She spoke clearly. She told them about the contract, the debt, the cellar. She told them about the locked door, the oil lamp, the pallet, the dye basin. She told them about the day Stroud moved her underground and the lie he had told to make it sound reasonable. She told them about the 18 months she had worked beyond the repayment of her debt, without knowing it was paid. Faye presented her records. 3 years of meticulous documentation, dates and quantities and prices, written in the margins of kitchen accounts in handwriting so small it required a magnifying lens to read. The council examined them in silence. The evidence was devastating. When Faye was called to speak, she stood before the council with her hands clasped in front of her, her voice clear and unhesitating. "I brought her meals twice a day for 3 years," Faye said. "Porridge in the morning, whatever scraps the kitchen could spare at night. For the first 6 months she wouldn't speak to me. She thought I was part of it. She thought I was watching her for Stroud, reporting back on whether she was compliant." Faye's hands tightened around each other. When she finally spoke, the first thing she asked me was whether the river was still there. Not whether anyone was looking for her. Not whether the debt was paid. Whether the river was still there. She could hear it through the walls, and she wanted to know if it was real or if the silence was making her imagine things. The hall was absolutely still. Della kept her eyes forward. She had not known Faye would say this. She had not known Faye remembered. "I started keeping records because I couldn't get her out," Faye continued. "I didn't have the power or the standing or the authority. I was a kitchen attendant. I peeled turnips. But I could count, and I could write small, and I could make sure that if anyone ever opened that door, the truth would be waiting for them." She looked at Stroud. Her expression was calm and final. 3 years of margins," she said, "and every word is true." Stroud tried once more. He stood in the center of the hall in his dark olive vest and wolf-tooth necklace, and he looked at Della, and his lip curled. "She was nothing when I found her," he said to the council, "an orphan dyer with a debt she couldn't pay and a wolf too weak to shift. I gave her purpose. I gave her value. Everything she is, she owes to—" "I owe you nothing." Della's voice cut through the hall. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. The words carried the weight of 3 years of silence, 3 years of swallowed words and bitten tongues, and the slow, corrosive patience of survival. You did not give me purpose. You stole my labor and called it charity. You did not give me value. You recognized my value and imprisoned it for profit. And you did not shelter me. You buried me. She stepped forward. The council watched. Asher, seated at the head of the hall, watched, and she could feel his bond humming with something that was neither fury nor fear, but a fierce, radiant pride. I survived your cellar, she said, looking at Stroud. I survived your darkness and your silence and your locked door. And I did it not because of you, but in spite of you. Every bolt of wool I dyed was an act of defiance you were too blind to recognize. Every color I mixed was proof that you could take everything from me except the thing that mattered most. She held up her hands, stained, cracked, strong. I am not nothing. I am not the girl you buried. I am the girl who kept working and kept breathing and kept being too stubborn to dissolve. And now I am standing in your hall, in your light, and you are the one who is going to disappear. The council ruled unanimously. Stroud was stripped of his territorial authority. His hold was placed under Crown administration. Every bonded laborer in his territory was to have their contracts reviewed, and the cellar door was ordered sealed permanently. That night, Della stood on the balcony of the room that had once been Stroud's finest guest chamber, and she breathed in the night air, and she felt the copper ring on her finger vibrate gently, not with warning or urgency, but with something that felt like contentment. Asher found her there. He stood beside her, his shoulder against hers, and they looked out at the river, silver under the moon, singing its slow, constant song. What do you want to do now? He asked. I want to open a dye works, she said. A real one, above ground, with windows. Where? I don't know yet. Somewhere with good water and plenty of light. She paused. And somewhere near you. His hand found hers in the dark, their fingers interlaced. The golden light between them pulsed, steady and warm. A rhythm that matched the river and the moon, and the slow, certain knowledge that the door between them stood open, and would always stand open, and neither of them would ever close it again. I love you, she said. The words surprised her, not because she hadn't felt them, but because they came out so easily, without the weight of transaction, without the fear of cost. They were simply true. He brought her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles. His mouth lingered there, warm against her stained skin. I love you, he said, and I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never run out of reasons to believe that. I have one condition. Name it. Never lock a door behind me. Never. His voice was rough with promise. Not once. Not ever. 3 months later, the dye works opened. Della stood in the main workroom, sunlight pouring through 6 tall windows, and watched the light hit the skeins of freshly dyed wool hanging from the drying racks. Cobalt, saffron, a deep wine red that she had spent 3 weeks perfecting. The colors were extraordinary, richer than anything the markets had seen, and the orders were already arriving faster than she could fill them. Faye managed the accounts. Properly this time, in actual ledger books, with actual ink, on actual pages. She had moved from Stroud's Hold to the capital without hesitation, had arrived at the dye works on its first day and said, I'm not writing in margins anymore. And that had been that. The workshop employed 6 dyers, all of them women Della had found through the bonded labor review Asher had ordered across the entire region. Women who, like her, had been hidden, exploited, disappeared into the margins of a system that had never learned to see them. They were learning her methods. They were good. They were getting better. And they worked in rooms with windows and unlocked doors and the sound of the river drifting through the open casements. One of them, A young woman named Hetty, who had been kept in a weaving shed in the eastern lowlands for 2 years, had arrived at the dye works unable to meet anyone's eyes. She worked with her shoulders hunched and her gaze on the floor, flinching at sudden sounds, occupying as little space as possible. Della recognized every gesture. She had made them all herself. She didn't push. She gave Hetty a basin by the largest window, where the light was warmest and the river was loudest, and she let the work do what work does when it is chosen rather than coerced. 3 weeks later, Hetty laughed at something Faye said, and the sound was so surprised, so startled out of her, that she clapped her hand over her mouth and looked around as if she expected punishment. "It's all right," Della said. "Laughing is free here." Hetty's hand lowered slowly. "It doesn't feel free yet." "It will." Della touched her shoulder. "Give it time." Della was measuring Mordaunt when the door opened. She knew who it was before she turned. Knew by the way the copper ring on her finger hummed, by the way the golden light flared at the edge of her vision like sunrise beginning at the horizon. Asher stood in the doorway. He had come from the capital, still wearing his traveling coat, his dark hair windswept, his dark green eyes finding hers across the room with a look that still, 3 months later, made her breath catch. "How's the rent?" he asked. She laughed. The sound filled the workroom, bright and warm, and 3 of the dyers looked up from their basins with startled smiles, because Della laughed often now, but the sound still surprised people who remembered the girl from the cellar. "Expensive," she said. "The landlord is very demanding." "Is he?" Asher crossed the room, stepping over skeins of drying wool, navigating the cluttered workspace with the careful grace of a man who had learned that this was her kingdom and he was merely visiting. "What does he demand?" "Dinner. Every night. Even when he has to ride 4 hours from the capital to get here." Monster. Absolutely insufferable. He reached her. His hand settled on her waist, and he pulled her close, and she pressed her forehead against his chest and breathed him in, cedar and wind and the green wildness underneath. "I have something for you," he said. "If it's another edict about tariff exceptions for Omega-owned businesses, I told you, the language in Section 3 still needs." "It's not an edict." He reached into his coat and produced a small copper key. Simple, unadorned, warm from resting against his body. Della took it, turned it over in her stained fingers. "What does it open?" "Nothing." His eyes were soft. "It doesn't open anything. It's a key to a door that doesn't exist. Because I promised you that I would never lock a door behind you, and I wanted you to have proof that there is no lock, no door, no barrier between you and anything you want. It's yours. It means you are free. Not because I freed you, because you were always free, even when the world tried to convince you otherwise." The golden light blazed between them, warm and fierce and steady, and Della closed her fingers around the copper key, and she kissed him in the sunlight of her own workshop, in the room she had built, with the windows she had chosen, with the doors that opened from both sides. And outside, the river sang its slow, constant song, and the wool dried in colors that had no name, and the cellar door remained sealed, and the light was everywhere.